There comes a moment when a civilization stops asking whether it is going too far and simply moves forward, not because the path is safe, but because the silence of space seemed like an invitation. What you are about to witness is not just man's return to the moon in 2026. It is the resurgence of a pattern so ancient and so precise that it repeats itself every time humanity attempts to touch what God has reserved for himself. Get ready, because what NASA calls a breakthrough in the Artemis mission, the Bible calls a sign. What appears to be the pinnacle of our technology may in fact be the trigger for the event the world fears most. Right now, as you watch this, the Orion spacecraft is on a trajectory around the far side of the moon. Astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, the first human beings to leave Earth's orbit since Apollo 17 in December 1972, are flying through deep space. They will pass closer to the lunar surface than any human has been in over 50 years. The mission is called Artemis II. The name comes from Greek mythology. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, her domain, the moon, and the celestial wilderness. And it is worth asking, as it has always been worth asking whenever humanity raises its highest structure toward the heavens, what exactly is being reached for? And what does the reaching reveal about the heart that drives it? There is a passage in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, where Jesus sits with his disciples on the Mount of Olives and speaks about what is coming. He describes the temple they are looking at, its magnificent stones, its breathtaking construction, and tells them it will be thrown down, not one stone upon another. And then he speaks of a time when there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity. He was not composing poetry, he was answering a specific question: what will be the sign? And his answer reaches across every generation that has stood at the edge of its own greatest achievement and mistaken the height of the structure for the health of the soul within. This is not a warning against science. It is not a condemnation of rockets or engineers or the extraordinary courage of 4 people willing to travel 250,000 miles from everything they have ever known. It is something older and more precise than that. It is the recognition that every generation that has stood at the threshold of its own magnificence has faced the same interior question, one that no spacecraft can answer, no orbit can resolve. The question of what fills the center, of what the structure was built to serve. There is a place in the ancient world where heaven touched earth, where the name of God was not philosophy, it was architecture, where the stones of a city were laid not merely for commerce or defense, but as a declaration: we are a people set apart, chosen not for privilege alone, but for responsibility, bound not merely by blood, but by covenant. Jerusalem, the city of David, the city where the ark of the Lord had rested, where the fire of God had fallen upon the altar of Solomon and consumed the sacrifice in the sight of all Israel, where the pillar of cloud had moved and settled, and every priest who witnessed it had fallen on his face, because the weight of holiness is not something a man can stand beneath and remain unchanged. This was not mythology. This was memory. Living, inherited, spoken from father to son across generations like a flame passed from one hand to another in the dark. But memory, without vigilance, becomes ornament, and ornament becomes assumption, and assumption, in the slow, patient way that all great corruptions begin, becomes the first crack in a wall that once seemed unbreakable. The kingdom of Judah in the 7th century before the Common Era was not a kingdom in collapse. It was a functioning society, markets open, priests officiating, festivals observed, the calendar of the Lord still kept, at least in form. At least in the outer contours of ritual that, when seen from a distance, still resembled faithfulness. The danger of Judah was not that it had abandoned its heritage entirely, The danger was that it had kept the shell of it while quietly emptying the interior. Temple sacrifices continued. The Levites performed their duties. The words of the covenant were still recited. But beneath the surface of that religious activity, something else had been growing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, across decades of accumulated compromise. Manasseh had been king before this, 55 years on the throne of David, the longest reign in the history of Judah, and in those 55 years, he had not merely tolerated the worship of foreign gods, he had institutionalized it. He had rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had torn down. He had erected altars to Baal within the very courts of the temple. He had passed his own son through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom, the dark ritual of child sacrifice that Israel had been repeatedly warned against since the days of Moses. He had consulted mediums and spiritists, practiced divination and sorcery, filling Jerusalem with innocent blood until the text of 2 Kings states without softening. Manasseh shed innocent blood very much, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin, wherewith he made Judah to sin, in doing that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is not ancient exaggeration. This is the weight of what preceded the events we are exploring. This is the spiritual atmosphere into which the next generation was born. Not a world of obvious catastrophe, a world that had learned to call the catastrophe normal. A world where corruption had been present so long that it no longer registered as corruption. It had become the air. When Manasseh's grandson ascended to the throne, a boy of 8 years old, placed on the seat of David by a people who perhaps believed that youth might mean a clean beginning, something unexpected happened. His name was Josiah. And he would become, in the language of Scripture, a king unlike any who came before or after him in the line of Judah. A king who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. That language is not ordinary praise. It is the language of Deuteronomy, the language of the Shema itself, the central declaration of Israel's devotion. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The scribes who preserved this account were making a precise theological claim, that in Josiah they had seen something they had not seen in a long time, perhaps ever. But Josiah did not begin as a reformer. He began as a child whose father Amon had continued the wickedness of Manasseh and had been assassinated by his own servants after only 2 years on the throne. A child surrounded by the residue of half a century of institutionalized idolatry, raised in a court where the memory of faithfulness was at least 2 generations old. By his 8th year of reign, still only 16 years old, he had begun to seek the God of his ancestor David, and by his 12th year, he had begun the systematic dismantling of everything Manasseh had built. He moved through Judah, then into the territory of the former northern kingdom. High places leveled, altars broken, carved images ground to dust. The bones of the priests who had served at those altars exhumed and burned on the very places where they had offered incense to other gods. It was radical, comprehensive. The action of a man who understood that half measures in the face of this kind of corruption would accomplish nothing at all. But there is a scene, a single scene, within this sweeping reformation that carries a weight unlike any other. A moment that begins not with policy or proclamation, but with the discovery of a book. The temple had been in disrepair. Josiah had given orders and funds to restore it. The high priest Hilkiah was overseeing the work, and in the process of that restoration, in the dusty, neglected chambers of a building whose spiritual function had been compromised for generations, a scroll was found. Hilkiah brought it to Shaphan the scribe. Shaphan brought it to the king, and Shaphan read it aloud to Josiah. The text calls it the Book of the Law, the Torah, the covenant document given through Moses. Whatever the specific portion that reached the king's ears that day, the effect on Josiah was immediate and devastating. He tore his robes. That is not a minor detail. In the ancient world, tearing one's garments was not theater. It was not performative grief for public consumption. It was the physical expression of an interior reality so overwhelming that the body could not contain it. A grief that had to find some outward form because it had nowhere else to go. Kings did not tear their garments lightly. Kings who tore their garments in the presence of their court were making themselves vulnerable in a way that carried real social and political cost. Josiah tore his robes because he understood, in one reading, in one encounter with the ancient words, exactly what his nation had done, and exactly what the covenant said would follow. He sent immediately to the prophetess Huldah, not to be comforted, not to be told that perhaps the text meant something more forgiving than it appeared. He sent to know the truth, whatever the truth was. And the truth, delivered through Huldah's voice, was this: the disaster described in the covenant would come. It would not be averted. The generations of idolatry, the shed blood, the corruption institutionalized across decades, the weight of it had accumulated beyond a threshold that even Josiah's faithfulness could reset. The scroll's warnings had been ignored too long. The door had been held open to darkness long enough that what had entered could not simply be walked back out. But, and this is the mercy embedded in the message, because Josiah's heart was tender, because he had humbled himself, because he had wept, he himself would not see it. He would be gathered to his fathers in peace. He would be spared the sight of the catastrophe his ancestors had made inevitable. This was not comfort. It was a door closing, not in anger, but in finality. The sound of consequences that were planted long ago completing their arc, regardless of who now sits on the throne. And yet, Josiah did not retreat. He did not respond with resignation or despair. What the text records next is one of the most remarkable sequences in the entire history of the monarchy. Josiah gathered all the people, every elder of Judah and Jerusalem, every inhabitant of the city, priests and Levites and all the people from the greatest to the least. And he stood by the pillar of the temple, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant. And then he made a covenant before the Lord, to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. He knew it would not stop what was coming. He knew because Huldah had told him. But he did it anyway, because a man who understands what is right does not stop doing what is right, simply because the outcome has already been determined by those who came before him. He could not undo the past. He could not compel a different future. But he could be in the present what Israel was always called to be. The Passover that followed was unlike any since the days of the judges. 2 Kings 23:22 makes this claim without softening. There was not held such a Passover from the days of the judges that judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel, nor of the kings of Judah. In the middle of an irreversible sentence, in the midst of a nation still carrying the weight of its corruption, beneath the surface of its renewed practice, a Passover observed as if it mattered, because it did, not because it would change the political trajectory, but because the posture of a human soul before God is not contingent on outcome. There are stages in how a society arrives at the place where such a moment becomes necessary. It is worth tracing them, not to assign blame, but to recognize the pattern, because the pattern does not belong only to Judah. The first stage is always small, the introduction of the alternative, the high places, the familiar rituals, the syncretism that feels harmless because it is traditional. Solomon himself had allowed it. For the sake of political alliance, for the sake of the peace that comes from not making everything a confrontation. The structures were built, the worship was tolerated, the line moved. And once a line moves, the new position becomes the baseline. The next generation is born into a world where the high places are already there. They did not build them, they only inherited them. And inheritance, without critical examination, becomes normality. The second stage is normalization. What once caused discomfort is now simply part of the landscape. The shrines are old, the priests who serve them are established. To object to them now feels like objecting to the soil itself. The third stage is institutionalization, where Manasseh arrived. The alternative becomes not merely tolerated, but embedded in the courts, in the priesthood, in the very temple complex built to house the name of the Lord. It is no longer fringe, it is the center. And those who remember what the center was supposed to look like become increasingly the troublers. The fourth stage is numbness. Not rage, not celebration, just the flat indifference of a people who have been living with corruption long enough that the nerve endings no longer fire. The innocent blood that fills Jerusalem from one end to the other stops being a scandal and becomes simply the way things are. When a society reaches this stage, when it can no longer feel its own disease, the prognosis changes. Reform is still possible. Josiah proves that. But the structural consequences of accumulated choices pressing on the future do not dissolve simply because a righteous man now sits on the throne. What follows Josiah confirms this with a brutality the text does not flinch from. Josiah died in battle at Megiddo at 39 years old. After him came sons who had not inherited his heart. Jehoahaz reigned 3 months and did evil. Jehoiakim reigned 11 years and did evil. Jehoiakim reigned 3 months and did evil. Zedekiah reigned 11 years and did evil. Nebuchadnezzar came the first time, the second time, the third time, each campaign more devastating than the last, as if even in judgment there was a measured quality, a reluctance to arrive all at once at the final thing. Jeremiah spoke through all of it. He was beaten, placed in stocks, lowered into a cistern. He wept and then spoke again, because a prophet does not speak because it is working. He speaks because silence would be a different kind of betrayal. The final siege lasted 1.5 years. When the walls broke, Zedekiah fled and was captured in the plains of Jericho, brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and made to watch his sons executed one by one before his eyes, so that the last thing those eyes ever saw was the death of his children before they were put out. Bound in bronze chains, taken to Babylon. The temple was burned, the walls of Jerusalem broken down, the city that had been the dwelling place of the name of God, reduced to rubble and ash. At this moment, 4 astronauts are passing around the far side of the moon. The world is watching live feeds, reading updates, marveling at images of Earth seen as a crescent from deep space. And it is possible to watch all of that and see only the technology, the engineering, the courage, to look at what humanity has built and feel only pride in the height of the structure. Just as Judah looked at the stones of the temple and felt secure, just as the people pointed to the pillars and said, "We have not abandoned God. Look, the sacrifices continue," so too a generation can look at its most magnificent achievements and mistake the height of the structure for the health of the soul within. The idols change shape. They always do. They rarely arrive announcing themselves as competition for the central devotion of a people's life. They arrive as supplements, as harmless additions, as things that exist on the periphery, that surely cannot threaten what stands at the center. And the center over time begins to hollow. The names have changed. The hunger has not. We may not build altars of stone, but we still orient our lives, our fear, and our hope toward things that were never meant to bear that weight. The question the Artemis mission cannot answer, the question no mission ever launched has answered, is the question of what fills the interior when the exterior keeps expanding. What keeps the center from becoming a dusty chamber where a scroll has not been read in so long that when someone finally opens it, a king tears his robes, because the scroll was there all along, in the chamber, waiting for someone willing to find it, willing to read it without the anesthetic of familiarity, willing to let it do what sacred words do, when they are finally allowed to reach the human heart without the comfortable assumption that because the forms are still in place, the substance must be too. And when that reading happens, even in the middle of an irreversible sentence, even knowing that the consequences of what came before cannot be wished away, the right response is still what Josiah showed: to gather, to read aloud, to covenant, to stand in the gap between what is and what was always intended, and to hold that ground with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, not because the rockets are grounded, not because the pattern is stopped, but because that is what it means to be, in this generation, a keeper of the flame.